everyone, Scott Hansen here from NFL Red Zone. I hope you're checking out 1 hour of 5 Yard Rush, one of the best podcasts on NFL football in the UK.
Good evening, Rush Nation. My name is Hannah and I am your host for this week on the 5 Yard Dynasty show. And this evening I am joined by an awesome guest. He is part of my other family, the Fantasy Wildcard, and he of course is one of the co-hosts from the Fantasy Wildcard Dynasty show. Tonight I'm being joined by the fantastic Ali at FF Dynasty Grill. How are you, Ali? And how's it going?
Yeah, really good. Thank you, Hannah. Yeah, it seems like 5 minutes ago we were chatting on our show a couple of days ago. So looking forward to that going out. And yeah, doing really good. It's an exciting time of the season, isn't it? Where the preseason started. We've already seen some rookies in action and that. And we're ramping up for the main event, the normal season, the regular season. Just can't wait to get going and excited for our show tonight. How you doing, Hannah?
Yeah, I'm good, thank you. And I totally agree, Ali. It's that kind of time of year, isn't it, where things start kind of bubbling up. People see things from training camp or pre-season and they get really excited and they think, oh, this rookie that I drafted or who I thought was better than everyone else is looking really good. But obviously the proof is in the pudding and we're about to find out as we get into September. So, Ali, I've brought you on this week. You're starting our kind of division discussion kind of series. And I thought you would be a good first guest to have because we do have the AFC and the NFC East, but we've also got the NFC South, which I did choose especially for you, Ali, because I know you are a Bucks fan. So I'm sure you're going to give us some great insights there and let us know what you think. So basically what I've done this week, Ali, is that I've picked a player from each division and team that I thought would be kind of worthy of discussion. Are we back?
We're back. I think we're back. I don't know what happened.
We're back. Disaster. Anyway, basically we're looking at each team and we're picking one player from these divisions that I think are worthy for discussion, you know, whether we think that their value is gaining, falling, or what we kind of want to do with them if they're on our teams or whether we want to acquire them for our teams or not. So shall we start with the AFC East, Ali? And I think with that, we have to look at the reigning champions, and that is the Buffalo Bills. Now, the one player that I was kind of particularly interested to chat to you about was Gabe Davis. So before the 2022 season, obviously we had this really big hype. He'd had that playoff game where he'd caught 4 touchdowns. Everyone thought he was going to be the next thing. He was going to step up and be this wide receiver 2 on the team. And his ADP, according to DLF, was wide receiver 27. Then last season, you know, didn't really quite live up to the hype. He was injured, and that brought his ADP crashing right down to a low of wide receiver 54. Now, slowly, things have kind of started to creep up again. I think people have realised that they're not going to bring someone in like DeAndre Hopkins. Gabe is likely to remain the wide receiver 2 on this team. And I think people are potentially thinking that he might maybe show something. So his current ADP is wide receiver 45. So I'm actually really interested to your thoughts on some of these recent trades for him. So some people have got Gabe Davis for Antonio Gibson. Some have got him for a direct trade for Jimmy G. And some have got him for a 24 third-round pick. So what I'm really interested in, Ali, is do you have any interest in Gabe Davis? And would you be buying him for this price? Or are you totally out at this point?
I think as a whole, the Dynasty committee, when you look at the wide receivers, we've really grown pretty wise this season or this off season because there's so many that I thought last season were either ranked too high, i.e. Gabe Davis, people like Jameson Williams, who wasn't going to see the field and really struggled. But then they've really sort of fallen back into where I think is a decent and fair price for these players. So Gabe Davis at wide receiver 45 is probably not a price that I'm going to be going out and actively buying Gabe Davis. But if he falls to me around about there, and the offer's fair, which I think in these three scenarios, it's pretty fair, to be honest. They're really equal trades. Probably not actively buying, but I think it's a fair ADP. I don't think I'd be selling at wide receiver 45 because I think the situation that he's in, the age that he is, I think that you can definitely sell in season for higher than wide receiver 45. You can get much more for him. But then I do look around the ADP and the rankings of wide receiver 45, sort of between 40 and 50, and there's a few people that I'd rather take over Gabe Davis, if I'm honest. Someone that's going to give you, as you mentioned, he's someone that can score 4 touchdowns in a game and win you a week, but then he can also help lose you a week if he's in your starting spots because he disappears. So people like Tyler Lockett, a lot of people are writing him off. I think I'd rather him than Gabe Davis, and I think he's going one spot below him. And then people a bit younger like Marvin Mims, Rashad Bateman. They're all in that ballpark for me at wide receiver 45. And perhaps I'd prefer them over Gabe Davis. But honestly, you can't deny, again, the opportunity that he's got with the Bills this year. They, as you mentioned, they didn't bring in DeAndre Hopkins. They've still got Stephon Diggs, but he doesn't seem like he's the happiest person in the world right now. There's sort of a weird thing going on with him during the offseason. So you can't deny it. Gabe Davis looks to have a really big role, an integral role for the Bills this year, and that they're obviously going to push for a Super Bowl. I think they're going to be right up there again. It just means he has to make it stick this year because you've got obviously Dalton Kincaid on a rookie deal. It'll be his first year. I can imagine he'll be slowly introduced. But there'll be a lot resting on Gabe Davis. If the Bills are going to go far, I think Gabe Davis needs to take them there. So he needs to be more consistent, and we might see it. Wide receiver 45, I think, going back to my motto, I'd like to have one share because we've seen what he can do, but he just lets you down so often. He'll follow up with a couple of dud weeks. So he's a really frustrating player to own, but perhaps if you've got Josh Allen and have that cheap stack, if you don't want to pair him with Diggs or you can't afford to pair him with Diggs, perhaps Gabe Davis is the way to go for this season. So, I don't mind Gabe Davis. I think that price is fair. I wouldn't be actively buying, but I also wouldn't be selling at that price because I think there is scope for him to move possibly a little bit higher. What are your feelings on Gabe Davis?
On the whole, I think I probably agree with you there. Look at wide receiver 45. I actually don't think that's too bad at all at this point. Like you say, last season he had a disappointing season. He's never really shown us enough, apart from those odd spike weeks, I don't think, for him to be any higher than that. But I also think there are still some Gabe Davis truthers out there. And I think I would be doing exactly the same as you, Ali, if I had him on my team and I was thinking, I'm not really massively keen on him. I would wait till in season when he has one of those kind of boom weeks, which he probably will have at some point. Find your Gabe Davis truther and be like, oh, look, you were right. Would you like him? Mm-hmm. And see if you can sell him for some sort of profit. I do think obviously more and more people are now playing these Dynasty best ball leagues. And I think he's probably more suitable for those kind of teams where obviously he'll get in your lineup on those kind of boom weeks, but he's not going to hurt your team on the bust weeks because he'll be sat on your bench. So if I had a best ball team, I'd probably certainly be more interested on having him on there. But I agree with you. He's going to be tough to know when best to put in lineups and when not. And that always makes these kind of players quite infuriating, doesn't it? So best ball, I'm definitely into him a bit more. Kind of normal redraft type dynasty leagues, then probably less keen. And like you say, if he's around there, Tyler Lockett's gone, and he's kind of value on the board on a startup, then I'll take him. If not, I'm not too fussed. So sounds like we've got a similar kind of mindset on him there. So shall we look at kind of the next player I'd like to discuss, and we're going to move to the Miami Dolphins. Now, this is a guy that I think you probably expect us to talk about, and that's obviously Tua. He was actually off to a really promising start in 2022. That offense looked kind of really on fire and quite explosive. And he was kind of one of the main catalysts for that, getting the ball out to those two fantastic receivers. But then obviously we know he got those multiple concussions and that derailed his season. So really, my interest of what I want to hear from you, Ali, is what are your thoughts on Tua? He's currently about around QB 12 in ADP, and is he someone that potentially you're buying now, or is he too risky at this time, and you just want to kind of leave well alone and see what happens over the course of this season?
Yeah, I really do like Tua. I'll start with there. I think quarterback 12, I think, again, it's fair, like Gabe Davis's price. I think I've personally got him a couple of spots lower. I think I've got the rookie quarterbacks, Bryce Young and CJ Stroud, ahead of him just because of that risk that you've mentioned. Obviously, last year, points per game and when he was in the offense, it looked incredible, the games that he was in. But obviously, he is clearly elevated because of the two weapons that he's got in Waddle and Tyreek Hill. If he didn't have them weapons, he'd be nowhere near a quarterback one in terms of Dynasty. I do really like him in terms of a rookie profile. I actually had him slightly ahead of Joe Burrow coming out, so I'm always going to root for Tua. It's not speaking to the wrong person here, clearly.
We can't be having that.
I'm obviously going to root for Tua. I really want him to succeed, but there's clearly risk there. If he picks up a concussion, I hate to say it, early on in the season, there's going to be more question marks around can he carry on if he takes some big hits. Hopefully it's not going to be the case. And I think if you've got Tua, if you're a team that is competing, I think he's a perfect quarterback too. I think got him in a bucket with Dak Prescott and Daniel Jones as three quarterbacks that if I'm competing, I really want them as my quarterback too, because they can perform week in, week out as a quarterback one. They can fall in as a low quarterback one and help win me championships. And I'm not paying the elite price of a top 6 or 7 quarterback. But yeah, there is certainly risk. I really like Tua. I'm absolutely rooting for him. I think as long as he can stay healthy in this offense, is going to absolutely click. I think it's going to be the same as we saw last season. They obviously drafted the running back Devon A-Chain, which is just even more speed on the offense, which is going to be terrifying for teams to come up against. They're going to be a really exciting team to watch. But in terms of Dynasty, I think quarterback 12 is fair again. I'm probably not actively buying at quarterback 12 because there is a risk there, and I'd probably prefer to buy maybe a Daniel Jones. That's probably going to cost me cheaper than Tua, but I know what I'm going to get from Daniel Jones for the next couple of years. But yeah, if you want to shoot for the ceiling, go for Tua because you've got at least 2 years with Tyreek Hill and obviously Jalen Waddle there. They're going to perform at elite level where you're going to have Tua as a low quarterback one, and that's exactly all you can ask for him at this ADP. So there is risk, but yeah, I wouldn't be selling him. I think it's going to be a bit of a wild ride, but you're going to get the most out of him at quarterback 12.
Is he one where you would consider, let's say that you think you're a contender at the beginning of the season, you're like, great, I've got Tua as my QB2, and then, one of your main or a couple of your main players go down and you think, right, that's my season over. If things are kind of going well on the Dolphins, he's staying healthy, would you then consider selling him, a few weeks in and trying to get what you can from him? Or would you want to try and risk riding him and keeping him potentially as a cornerstone if he stays healthy?
Yeah, so a move that I've actually made probably about a month ago now was I traded him straight up for Kyler Murray, and that was for a team I wasn't competing in, but along the same lines of what you just said there. If perhaps you thought you were going to compete for this season, and perhaps you're 1-4, but doesn't quite work out at the start of the season, I think there's every chance you can trade him for someone like a Kyler Murray. There's perhaps an injured quarterback. Much safer pick, I think, in Kyler Murray. Obviously, it's all up in the air about what's going to happen at the Cardinals come the end of the season if they get the number 1 pick. But Kyler Murray is going to be a quarterback. As soon as he sees the field, he's a top 10 option with top 5 upside. So that's the sort of move I'd like to make, is get rid of that risk. I certainly don't want a lot of shares of Tua, but I want a couple because of how explosive this offense can be. But I don't think you want 50% exposure to Tua because it can go so badly wrong. We've seen with Andrew Luck how he had to retire early on, and obviously Tua after last season there was rumours that he contemplated retiring. But obviously he's back now and it's looking exciting again. But you don't want too big exposure, I'd say, to Tua.
Yeah, I don't think I could argue with that at all. Just another quick kind of sub question, and I'm kind of bringing this out of the blue, Ali, so you might not be prepared for it. But if Tua goes down in the middle of this season, and obviously they end up having to play Skylar Thompson, I don't even know who else they've got. Oh, Mike White, haven't they? Mike White and Skylar Thompson for the rest of the season. What are your thoughts in terms of a Tyreek Hill and a Jalen Waddle? Because obviously then the risk we have is that, let's say he plays 6 games and they win them, then, he goes down and they manage to win another 1 or 2. So they're not actually anywhere where they can get a QB, but they also don't really have a viable longer-term QB option on the roster. Do you have concerns for Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle then at that point? Or do you think that actually they're talented enough that we can probably ride out this season and they'll find someone? I guess it could be a Kirk Cousins or a Kyler if, that they manage to get Caleb Williams or whatever that might be.
Or a Tom Brady coming out of retirement. Yeah,
that's true.
I think that the head coach there is absolutely fantastic. I think he's top 5 in the NFL. I think they would find a way to get a quarterback coming in there. As you mentioned, you've got Kirk Cousins, uncertain about his future next year. I think the Dolphins are ready to go all in. So if it doesn't work out with Tua this year, then I think that they can easily move on from him and get someone else in, one of these veterans that will come in. And it's only got to be a half competent quarterback, because let's just face it, he's not amazing. He has played as well as I probably thought he was going to play, but perhaps not fulfilled his potential yet. I think they can bring in someone like a Derek Carr, like a Kirk Cousins, that can fill that role just as well. We've seen plenty of times where Tua has underthrown Tyreek Hill, should be saying. Tyreek Hill makes it look like a really good throw, but really we know it's not the best throw. It's certainly not Patrick Mahomes, but yeah, I think that offense will be fine, and them 2 weapons will be fine.
Yeah, I think you make great points there. So I'd like to stick with the QB theme here, move on to our next team, and that is the New York Jets. Of course, they brought in their new QB this offseason, Aaron Rodgers, and they're loving telling everyone about it, particularly on Hard Knocks. And obviously, historically, when Tom Brady was still playing, he was often touted by a lot of analysts as kind of a cheap win now piece, for the last few years that he was playing. If you're a contender, potentially you can grab him really cheaply and he can be, a comfortable QB2 that will likely have multiple QB1 weeks. Now, we know Aaron Rodgers, he has contemplated retirement for a number of seasons now, so he is getting towards the end. But he did have quite a rough season last year. So do you think he's going to bounce back on this kind of youthful and peppy Jets team? And if you've got a contending team, are you buying him or are you steering well clear at the moment?
I wouldn't say I'm steering well clear, but I think his ADP is going to continue to rise as we approach the season, as we see more Hard Knocks. We obviously just had the Dalvin Cook signing, so it's pretty much a poor version of the Buccaneers Tom Brady era. That's how I'm putting it there. They're clearly going all in. They've got the defense they think to do it. They've got some offensive pieces. They've obviously given him his old weapons back from the Green Bay days. So Rodgers, I think, is going to fit seamlessly in there. They've got his old OC. They've got a lot of pieces that are familiar to Aaron Rodgers. So I think personally he's going to hit the ground running, which is good for anyone that's buying into him this offseason. Personally, I'm not putting too much stock into Aaron Rodgers. I think personally he's there to clearly just win a Super Bowl for the New York Jets, whether it's him throwing 50 touchdowns or him throwing 28 touchdowns, but limiting the mistakes and just managing the game, because their defense was that special, looked great last year. They almost got themselves in playoff contention last year, and look at who the quarterbacks were last year for the Jets. So Aaron Rodgers doesn't really need to do too much. He just needs to limit the mistakes, and his experience enough to know how to win games. So I think we're not going to see a massive season for Aaron Rodgers. The only really exception where I probably would want Aaron Rodgers if I'm a contender, if I feel like I haven't got that established quarterback to But I have got Garrett Wilson in my team because I do think that's going to be a pretty special link up between the two this season, where the overall wide receiver one could be in the realms of possibility for Garrett Wilson. In terms of Aaron Rodgers, I think he can probably be a top 10 quarterback, but I wouldn't push him anywhere near the top 7 or 8. Perhaps a low quarterback one will be where his ceiling is. I think you're not going to get much rushing from Aaron Rodgers, although he has slimmed down. He looks in really great shape, but I don't think he's there to do that. Obviously, they've now got Dalvin Cook. They've got Breece Hall coming off the pup today. So, this offense is going to look great, but I don't think Aaron Rodgers is in for a special season. I think he's there to manage the game, and they're going to win the game by running the ball and their defense at the end of the day. I think it's going to work, but in terms of fantasy, it's not going to win you championships.
So if you were that contender, would you be looking to target, like you said before, someone like a Daniel Jones, a Dak Prescott over Aaron Rodgers here? And then I guess you'll also have a bit more longevity with those as well for your team, rather than, every off season we get this drama. Aaron Rodgers is going to retire. He isn't. He says next off season he isn't, but if he has a bad season, I won't be surprised if he once again threatens to do that. But yeah, again, Ali, I can't kind of argue with you there, really. I think one of the reasons that Tom Brady was such a great asset towards the end was that the Bucs threw the ball just so much that that volume that he was having, made that massive difference and kept him as a regular kind of QB1. Whereas, like you say, they've got Breece Hall, they've got Dalvin Cook. They're not going to be throwing the ball a million times. They just don't need to, especially with that defense as well. So I agree. I just can't see him becoming that kind of anything other than a low-end QB1. And like you say, there's potentially, especially with the hype around him, there might be cheaper targets that will probably do the same job and last on your team a bit longer. Now, I feel like we have to touch on this team because they are the other team in the division. But to be honest, I couldn't really think of anyone that was particularly that bothered talking about. So I thought I'd hand this over to you, Ali. Is there anyone on the New England Patriots that you think is even worth talking about at this point?
Well, I thought just being so we had the Zeke signing this week, we should just mention Ramondre Stevenson and the effect it has on him, because I've seen a lot of back and forth saying that it's going to destroy Ramondre Stevenson for this year, and a lot of people, including myself, that say you really shouldn't fade Ramondre Stevenson because of the Zeke signing. I know they gave him, I think it was $6 billion. Less than what Dalvin Cook got with the Jets. I personally think Zeke is, I'm not going to say he's washed, although I did say that on Twitter today, but I think he's not got much juice left. I think he's still got a role to play. He's clearly still a good pass protector, and they may use him on the goal line. But if you look in the stats, Ramondre Stevenson didn't have many goal line carries at all last year anyway. I think it was something like 6. And obviously he had a great fantasy finish and didn't require that. So personally, I think the effect on Ramondre is fairly small. I think it's the Patriots were always going to sign someone to that role. So to get Zeke, who I think hasn't got much left in the tank, is actually fairly good for Ramondre. But yeah, I'm just waiting for that first game where the goal line carry goes to Zeke, and you just wait for the vultures on Twitter saying, "I told you should have faded Ramondre." But yeah, in terms of Ramondre's ceiling for the season, I don't think it affects it too much. I still think he can easily finish as a top 10 running back. So I would still be drafting him with confidence.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the other thing is this might be an opportunity here. If people are fading, then you could potentially get him cheaper. And then you've got a bit more of a deal in your startups. I would certainly be sniffing around and seeing what the Ramondre Stevenson owner thought in my current league. And if they're not very happy and they're willing to sell for cheaper, then maybe it's worth seeing what you can do to get him on your team. Because I agree, I think he's going to be a very valuable fantasy asset for a number of years to come. So he's worth having on your team if you can get him, particularly at a discount.
Agreed.
So we've talked about, obviously, mainly my picks from this division and the players that I wanted to talk about. But before we move on to the next division, Ali, is there a player that you would like to talk about?
There certainly is. And Mags didn't pay me to say this name, but
I don't believe you, but go on.
It's going to be Dalton Kincaid because he has been a lot of the talk of the off-season, obviously going to the Buffalo Bills, and the hype was pretty out of control. And looking on Keep Trade Cup today, it still is his tight end 5 currently, which might even be one spot higher than when I last checked. So, yeah, it's pretty crazy that. But the tight end 5 is obviously very close to his ceiling. I don't think he's a guy that can be up there with Travis Kelce in terms of that top tier in the next year or two, but I think he can be the next tier down. So at tight end 5, you're looking at pretty much his ceiling. But reports are that he looks great in camp. He's been running with the ones. He was targeted the other night, I think, and he's looking great. So I think there's an opportunity for Dalton Kincaid to catch touchdowns this season, to solidify that tight end 5 ranking. I personally don't think it's going to fall just because of the draft stock that he's got, the offense that he's in. I really like Dalton Kincaid. I'm glad that I've got him in several rookie drafts at the end of the first round, because I think his price is going to go up in the future if he catches 8 touchdowns this season and looks great, looks integral to that offense. And we talked about how shaky Gabe Davis is. So if Dalton Kincaid is playing in the slot and taking reps away from Gabe Davis and targets away from him, then yeah, he could eventually become sort of the tight end 4, 5, 6 for me in terms of dynasty, and sort of in that Dallas Goedert, TJ Hawkinson sort of role. But yeah, how are you feeling for Dalton Kincaid? I know he's obviously Mags's guy.
Yeah, I'm not a massive rookie tight end fan generally in Dynasty, because I just don't think they produce too often where we draft them. Now, having said that, if you got him in your rookie draft this season, I think that's actually probably pretty good, and I would certainly make sure I kept hold of him, because I think, like you say, ultimately I think he probably is going to be in that kind of lower elite tier, I suppose, as we might call it, going forward. I just couldn't pull the trigger to draft him in a startup, though. I just think he is really expensive in a startup. I think unless you get him in a rookie draft, I just don't see it worth, especially at this point, spending the draft capital on him. For me personally, if I'm going to pay up for him as tight end 5, I'd rather have him already be performing as tight end 5. So I'd rather have someone else hold him for a season and pay that, than pay that myself in a startup when he's probably, I mean, he might contribute something, but I'm not convinced he's necessarily going to be the tight end 5 this season. So I'd rather let him sit on someone else's bench and then get him, next off season, rather than paying up for him in a startup now. Would you agree with that, Ali, or would you be willing to pay up for him in a startup at this point?
No, so I think I've done 3, possibly 4 startups this off season and stayed well clear of him. To be honest, I've either gone for Kelce, Andrews, or I've faded the position completely and gone for an Njoku, perhaps a Waller, someone like that. And yeah, so Dalton Kincaid falls in the middle of where I'm not touching him. And I agree, his cost at startup is far too high. I think, as you mentioned, the rookie draft is and was the time to get him, because his value is going to be much higher in startups, as you mentioned.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really interested to see what he does this season, though. I feel like I've been a bit the harbinger of bad news, and whenever Mags mentions him, I'm like, no. But ultimately, I think he will be good. But I just think people are paying a lot of money, a lot of capital for him, particularly in startups now, which I just don't think he's going to be able to pay off this season. I might be proven wrong, but I don't know. So shall we move on to the next division, the NFC East? Another pretty exciting division, really. So let's start with, again, the current reigning champions, the Dallas Cowboys. So Tony Pollard, obviously, is currently the Cowboys' RB1. And with the Zeke news, we know that he's not going to be coming back and starting to rain on everyone's parade. But he is playing on the franchise tag, and there is some uncertainty to his future because of that. So what are you doing with Pollard? Currently, he's being valued as a running back 8. So to me, that seems like people don't seem to be actually that concerned about any uncertainty. But ultimately, after this season, we don't know where he's going to be.
Yeah, and I can certainly see the concern running back 8 for a guy that doesn't have a long-term starting gig. Certainly is risky. But there's people like him. There's people like Josh Jacobs, very much in the same boat right now. I think it's going to become the norm now with the dynasty running backs in the NFL that they're not going to get long-term contracts. So you are going to have to take risks on guys that are going to produce perhaps for this year and just take the hit and think, well, I've got an elite runner back this year, but he could end up a backup next year. It really is going to be crazy like that. But personally, I love Tony Pollard. I've got him ranked possibly even higher than runner back 8. He could be runner back 7. I need to check, but I've just been drafting him everywhere that I can this season and pretty much just looking at people's concern, and he has been dropping in startups because of that. The fact that he hasn't got a long-term contract. I personally think he will end up with a contract in Dallas, perhaps a 2-year deal. So I think he's going to be there for this year, obviously on the tag, and perhaps one more year, which will be great. And that's all I can ask for and for a running back right now. He was a 4th rounder, we need to remember. So I don't think he's going to be the type that will demand to be like one of the best paid running backs in the NFL. I think he'll more than likely take more of a friendlier deal to stay with the team to keep this offense together. So with running backs, I'm treating them very much now with a 2-year window. So it's really all I can ask for with Tony Pollard. My biggest concern is probably not the contract. It's actually the workload. I would like to see them perhaps sign one of these aging sort of veterans that will take some of the load off Tony Pollard, because we've not seen him for 17 games. So can his body handle it? I think he needs to be sort of the 1A to another running back 1B to sort of lighten the load so he can be that explosive back that we know Tony Pollard to be. So that's really my biggest concern would be, can his body handle it? But in terms of Tony Pollard in Dynasty right now, I'm definitely buying, but I can certainly see the concern. If you're not fully contending this year, then now is the time to get off Tony Pollard and probably sell at his peak value at running back 8.
So for you, Ali, obviously you're drafting him quite a bit at the moment and you'll have him on multiple teams. As we get to kind of the end of the season, what is your plan with him? Are you going to ride him for another year and risk kind of his value dropping potentially towards the end of, let's say, that second contract, if he gets another year next season? Or are you, like you say, kind of wait until the back end of the season? I suppose it depends what kind of teams you've got, but are you trying to move him while he's still got decent value, or are you happy to hold and kind of run it out and see what happens over the course of this and next season?
Yeah, so it's probably a bit of a cop-out, but it would be determined by whether my teams are in the playoffs. Then I obviously won't look to move on from Tony Pollard. If they are in the playoffs, I'm happy just to take the hit. There was a team last year where I made an awful trade with Kev. I had Travis Etienne and I traded him away for Leonard Fournette. It might have been the season before, actually, when Fournette was sort of a top 7 or 8 running back. But obviously right now it looks like a terrible trade because Fournette is just dust right now, and obviously Etienne is still a top 8, top 10 running back in Dynasty. But that's the sort of risk I'm willing to take on a contender. You just have to believe in your guys and just hope that Tony Pollard gets you another year or two on this team, or hopefully he has an opportunity elsewhere. But I think that's the risk that you have to take. You have to obviously be a contender, or if not, I would much rather sell a year too early. So if you're looking like you're not going to be a contender, then you have to get off him right now because it's not worth the risk of him fading away and becoming a Leonard Fournette.
Yeah, and obviously his value is pretty high at the moment, RB 8. So I think if you think, right, I'm not going to be able to contend this year, like you say, let's get that peak value, move it into other assets, and then obviously, see what cheaper running backs potentially you can get. So should we have a look at the New York Giants? So, after last season, people kind of started to cool on Darren Waller, really. He had his injuries and the Raiders just really struggled. But he has now got a fresh start on the Giants, and everyone anticipates him becoming like the top target on that team, really. And generally, over the course of the off-season, his ADP has slowly risen, and currently he's the tight end 8. But, we have to be aware that he is 30 now. He's no spring chicken anymore. But potentially he's seeing like a new lease of life in terms of his potential kind of targets and, I guess fantasy outlook, at least for this season. So what do you think fantasy managers should be looking to do with Waller at the moment?
Yeah, I'm pretty confident and pretty bullish on Darren Waller. There's obviously an injury risk with Waller. He's not been in the best health the last couple of years, but we have seen what he can produce in terms of fantasy. I think he had the tight end 2 finish, and at 30 years old, I mean that's not really old for a tight end. But he's still 3 years younger than Travis Kelce. He's still, from what we can see, incredibly athletic. So I think he is a cheap ticket to potentially have an elite tight end. So at tight end 8, I can't really see his value going up just because of his age. But I think he is, like I say, a cheap ticket where if you don't want to pay up for Mark Andrews, Travis Kelce, or Kyle Pitts and take the risk there, go for Darren Waller because he's much less cost, and he has the potential easily to finish as the top 3 tight end this season. I think he's personally easily going to finish as the top 5 as long as he can stay healthy. And I'm taking the risk because at tight end 8, I don't feel like there's that bigger investment to try and get an elite tight end potentially for the next 2 to 3 years. I still think he can produce at that sort of level. So a trade I actually made last week, I think it was, where I sold George Kittle for Darren Waller and Sky Moore. So that's the sort of move that I'm looking to make, is to move down from tight end sort of tier 2 and 3 to get into Waller's tier and pick up some extra capital. So someone like Pat Fryermuth, if I can trade him away for Darren Waller plus, that's the sort of move that I'm trying to make for Dynasty, especially for competing teams.
And would you be happy trying to get Waller on also a rebuild, or is this mainly a contending kind of plan? Because by the sounds of it, you have the feeling that he's going to be a decent tight end for the next few years. So could he still be valuable to you on a rebuild?
Yeah, certainly. If you're looking at quite a small rebuild or a bit of a retool, I think if you're obviously blowing it up and you're just trying to get loads of picks, I think now is the time that you can probably cash in and just not have that risk whatsoever of him re-injuring himself this season. Because if he ends up with a fairly decent injury at his age, then his value is going to fall off a cliff. But I think if you're not going into a massive rebuild, then why not? I think you're going to get at least 2 years out of Darren Waller as long as it works out to some extent this year. And I really think that he can be that top target in New York. So if you're retooling or rebuilding for a year and perhaps you want to compete next year, then Waller will be fine.
Yeah, I mean, I do really like Waller. I think, like you say, people are not quite, I think they are sleeping on him a little bit, really. I think because he is older and he's not a Travis Kelce, they're not really that interested. Now, potentially with him staying on the Raiders, I would probably say I might not still be interested. But I think the fact that he's had a fresh start on the Giants, they have 1 million slot receivers and no one else. He's likely to really, like you say, be that top target on the team and could have elite seasons for the next few years. So I think he's an awesome target at the moment, and I think he makes some really great points. So let's chat about the Philadelphia Eagles. this backfield is a little bit of a minefield at the moment, and we're hearing all sorts of different stories out of training camp as well. So currently, Swift and Penny are obviously on 1-year contracts. Gainwell is in his 3rd year, but he's never really had more than a 23% opportunity share over the past 2 seasons that he's played. So do you have any interest in any of these running backs in Dynasty? So currently they're going Swift as the RB 27 in ADP, Penny as the RB 42, and Kenneth Gainwell as the RB 53.
Yeah, so I've been an absolute massive fan of Rashad Penny all off season. I've been non-stop talking about his move to Philadelphia. I think is the one that people aren't talking about. A lot of people are still banging on about DeAndre Swift and the trade that they pulled off on draft night. But I do think out of the two, I'd much rather Rashad Penny, just because of the talent that he's got. I think he could potentially just explode on this offense. You've got Jalen Hurts that isn't going to dump the ball off an absolute ton to the running back. So I'm not looking for a pass catching running back on this Philadelphia Eagles team. So Rashad Penny just ticks all the boxes. A guy that historically averages something like 6 yards per carry throughout his time in Seattle, and that was with some really pretty bad offensive lines. So Penny is the one that I'm going to be targeting. Reports from camp the last couple of weeks aren't great. All I've seen is that Kenny Gainwell is actually the guy that's been taking all the first team reps the last 2 weeks, which is a bit of a surprise to me. I think if you go back to the Super Bowl, he was actually the running back that produced, and they obviously trusted him. But it was a bit of a surprise to see him sit out preseason game 1. Him and Boston Scott actually sat out that game, whereas Swift and Penny, they were in going sort of 1 and 2. I think Swift took the first carries and then Penny came in. So it's not, I've not got much DeAndre Swift whatsoever. I'm really concerned about him, especially at that ADP. I think a lot of people saw Swift's talent. They've seen how explosive this offense can be in Philadelphia, put 2 and 2 together. But I don't think it's going to work out for DeAndre Swift. I think he could be a massive bust at his cost. I've even heard from some Eagles beat writers that it's not going to wouldn't be an absolute massive shock to see Swift or Penny actually like a cut candidate when it comes to cut day. So that is a bit of a concern. But at running back 40, I'm still all in on Rashad Penny. I think that's a price worth paying. But if not, with the reports, you have to go with what the beat writers are saying, who's taken snaps with the ones. And Kenny Gainwell at running back 53, I think you need a few shares of him this season just in case he is actually the lead guy.
Would you be trying to trade for him at this point? I think people are hearing these rumblings about him running with the first team offense. Do you think he might be a bit more expensive now? Or actually, do you think even though potentially could be a bit more expensive, if he ultimately, runs with the ones, his cost is going to vault, isn't it really? So even if he is slightly more expensive, then maybe you could have got him earlier in the off season. Do you think it's still worth going in and grabbing him now before he ends up, his value ends up kind of bursting and growing really quickly?
Yeah, what you just said, I think this week is the week if you're going to go after Kenny Gainwell to take a risk on him now, because again, if we see him sit out the next game with the starters, then people are going to start putting 2 and 2 together. And if he's taken all the first team snaps in training camp, then they're going to work out that Kenny Gainwell's the guy to get. But I still think now he's going under the radar, so I think he's cheap enough where you can take a fly on Kenny Gainwell, and he's still not going to cost you a lot. I think you probably offer a 3rd round pick and get him right now, and it's probably worth it to get someone that could potentially be a lead guy on this team.
So let's move on to the Washington Commanders. Now, I think one of the talks of the off-season for this team, and something that has been under much debate on the Commanders, is obviously their current starting quarterback, Sam Howell. He's an unproven 5th round pick who, if he's good, could potentially have some great upside, but we actually just don't know what he's going to be like in the NFL. Obviously, we saw him for 1 game last season. Doesn't really tell us a lot. So, Ali, do you believe in Sam Howell? Are you a buyer or are you a seller?
Yeah, so I went onto Dynasty Planet earlier this week and just looked at who my most owned quarterbacks were, and surprisingly, I think 6 of the 7 were all Konami code quarterbacks. So I'm definitely buying Sam Howell just because of that cost of only ADP of quarterback. Was it quarterback 30? That is a price where I am intrigued, because I just think you're going to have Sam Howell as your quarterback 3 on your dynasty teams, and that's someone where I want to hit the ceiling. You're only really going to be starting your quarterback 3 in 2 games of the season, so I want a guy that I can have on my bench that is going to pop off, and it's going to get trade inquiries flying into my inbox. And Sam Howell, I think, is a guy that can potentially pop off and at least beat his ADP, and really doesn't have to do too much. I think as long as Sam Howell limits mistakes and just doesn't look terrible, then I think they're going to keep him in at quarterback, because I think he gives them the best chance of winning. I think you've obviously got Jahan Dotson and Terry McLaurin, 2 really good wide receivers. Then you've now got Eric Bieniemy, a great offensive coordinator. I'm excited to see what happens with that this season. So at quarterback 30, I think I'm buying just because of the price. If it was quarterback 24, I think you'd have to pump the brakes a bit. But at quarterback 30, I'm buying because I'm a quarterback 3. I'd rather have someone like a Sam Howell that can pop off and I can potentially trade him away for profit, rather than a Ridder or a Mac Jones, someone that's just going to plod along and give you 15 points a week and just not ever really pop off and win you championships. No one wants to trade for him. So yeah, I think it's worth taking the risk on Sam Howell, and I think you have to do it now, because if he starts the season really well, then I think his ADP is going to shoot up, because obviously he has that Konami code rushing.
So are you buying to sell, Ali, or might you keep some of your shares if he does pop off?
I think I'm probably buying to sell with Sam Howell. I don't think personally it's a long-term investment, but I do think with Sam Howell, I think this Commanders team is pretty sneaky good, where I think they're going to probably win enough games where they're not going to be picking top 10 next season. So they probably aren't going to be going for a quarterback, but in the future, Sam Howell's probably not the guy. So I would be definitely buying to sell in the future.
Yeah, and I think you make some great points. I have been out on Howell for most of the off-season, but to be fair, like you say, ultimately he's the starter. The week 1 game is with Arizona, so he's going to look good, and worst case scenario, you can sell him at that point, and probably make some sort of profit. And it doesn't even have to be a big profit, does it? You buy him for really cheap and you just sell him for, an extra asset, and you've won, ultimately. So yeah, I think you make a great point, and maybe I need to be drafting a little bit more Sam Howell so that I can sell him a bit later on when he's had his great game against Arizona. So Ali, before we move on to the NFC South, which is the player that you would like to discuss from this division?
Yes, there was plenty that I could have picked, but I've gone for Devonta Smith. So I just wanted to ask you a question, really, and just wanted to see how much of a gap you have between, obviously, AJ Brown, who is the wide receiver 1, and people have him ranked obviously higher than Devonta Smith. How much of a gap is there between AJ Brown and Devonta Smith for you? Because the gap is certainly closing for me. I think I've got AJ Brown as wide receiver 4 off the top of my head, and Devonta Smith as wide receiver 10. So 6 spots between them. But if you were to watch the back end of last season, you would really think that they were pretty much neck and neck, because Devonta Smith was holding his own and pretty much producing exactly the same as what AJ Brown was. So how much of a gap is there for you?
So currently for me, I would say that there is like a small tier between AJ Brown and Devonta Smith. I think we might have actually discussed this a little bit on the podathon, Ali, a few months ago. The Fantasy Wildcard podathon. If anybody missed it, feel free to go back and have a listen. And we were saying, should, based on kind of their performances at the end of last season, should we be maybe thinking of stepping back, selling AJ Brown, stepping down, getting some assets, and actually getting Devonta Smith, who potentially could have very similar fantasy performances to AJ Brown? We've seen it already. Or do we want to keep hold of AJ Brown, and have that more expensive asset who may not necessarily outperform his teammate? For me, I just think that AJ Brown probably is going to be more reliable than Devonta Smith ultimately. I think he is the top target on the offense. And I think if they have, last season they were pretty explosive in terms of, they're scoring lots of points. And that meant that both of them could do pretty well at most weeks. But I think probably more likely if they have a quieter week, AJ Brown's probably more likely to still get, reasonable number of targets and touchdowns versus Devonta Smith. Now, we did see a few games last season where it was reversed. Devonta Smith scored really highly and AJ Brown didn't so much. But I think on the whole, I think AJ Brown probably is more reliable. And I do think he is more talented than Devonta Smith. Not that I don't think Devonta Smith is not talented. He certainly is. They've got two great wide receivers there. But I think AJ Brown still is kind of 2 tiers above, even though the tiers are relatively small up there, It's not like there's a massive gap. So I guess in terms of what would I do if it was my team, and I think it would depend on what kind of team I've got. If I've got a contender, I think I probably would stick with AJ Brown because I think he's more likely to give me that consistency. If I've got either a retooler or something like that, then I might step down to Devonta Smith and then also pick up an asset from there. Because like you say, I think he certainly will have some really great weeks, and I think he'll be a good asset to have on your team. And he's young, so he's someone you can still build around, but you're getting extra assets as well. So I think that's probably where I would stand at the moment. Is that something you'd agree with, Ali, or have you got a different kind of opinion there?
Yeah, 100% exactly the same. In terms of startups, I tend to just look past AJ Brown. I'm not 100% sure why. Perhaps it's because I do really rate Devonta Smith so high. So when I pick a wide receiver early, I like to have like a Justin Jefferson or Jamar Chase, where he's clearly the number one. And last year just gave me a bit of pause for thought. So I've tend to sort of skip past AJ Brown, gone for another wide receiver, and then picked up Devonta Smith as my wide receiver 2. So perhaps sort of Garrett Wilson and Devonta Smith 1 and 2, rather than AJ Brown and someone else. But yeah, the gap is closing up, but there's definitely at least 1 or 2 tiers between them. And yeah, I think you're spot on. If you're competing, you want AJ Brown. If not, I think that's a great move to make, is to trade down and pick up some good assets.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, by the end of next offseason, we might be saying something completely different. Devonta Smith might have closed the gap even more. Be interesting to see. So before we finish, let's have a look at your division that you follow closely, Ali. Let's look at the NFC South. And obviously, we have to start with the current reigning champions by some kind of miracle, and that is the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. So, for me, the actual most interesting asset for me at the moment is Mike Evans on that team, because we know he has been a consistent fantasy asset for many years. But obviously at this point, he is getting up there a little bit. He's 29 now, and Tom Brady has recently been replaced by some sort of combination of Baker Mayfield and Kyle Trask. So, I think, again, historically, there's been a lot of recommendation for him to be a great target on a contender. He's quite cheap because nobody who's rebuilding particularly wants him because he's older. But do you think potentially that may now have changed? Do you think he's going to still put up another 1,000-yard season this season? Or do you think that potentially we're starting to see kind of that cliff approach and we should be looking to try and get out while we can?
Well, I mean, I'd be silly to come on here and start slating Mike Evans, because he's been my guy since he entered the league. He's my favourite player in the NFL by a mile. So, but try not to put too much of a biased hat on myself. I still think that he can have a decent role on a contender. I know obviously we've not got Tom Brady anymore. Baker Mayfield has looked, the last couple of weeks, he's looked much better, and he seems to be more confident in the offense. I think he's picking the playbook up a lot better. And Mike Evans, I know there's so many players around the league that say this, but he actually looks, and he's commented, and the coaches have commented that Mike Evans looks in the shape of his life right now. He looks faster, and he looks to be the number one target. I think having Chris Godwin back healthy for this year is only going to help Mike Evans. Obviously Mike Evans gets double teamed regardless, but takes a little bit of the flack off Mike Evans. I just think that what is he, wide receiver 40? I think that's just a great value, where I think even if this offense doesn't click and doesn't look amazing, he's still going to get 7 to 10 touchdowns in a 17-game season. I think he's nailed on for 1,000 yards. I think at wide receiver 40, if you're competing, I'll happily chuck out a second round pick, a future second, to get Mike Evans to have as my flex for someone that can win you a week. I think he won people championships. What was it last year with the 3 touchdowns against Carolina game was incredible. And that's the sort of game that he can still give you. And I think even with Baker Mayfield or Kyle Trask, they'll give you that as well. I think he's still going to have the touchdown ceiling. So not too many concerns with Mike Evans. Obviously, if you're not a contender, you need to be selling him either. Probably not now, because there's just no hype about the Buccaneers offense whatsoever. People just think Tom Brady's gone, Baker Mayfield's bad, that this offense is going to look even worse. But for long periods, the Buccaneers offense last year was absolutely tragic. The play calling was horrendous. The offensive line was terrible. There's actually reason to believe that this offense could, with new play calling, we've got a new O-line. We've got obviously Godwin back healthy. Rashad White is looking good. This offense could be slightly improved on last year. There's no reason why it can't be. So I think if you're going to sell him, probably don't sell him now. Wait for in season for him to have a decent game, and then target one of the competitors, and probably sell him there, where you probably get something more than what you would right now.
So there you are, everyone. The Bucs fan is telling you that Mike Evans is fantastic and you need to go out and buy him. So take that as you wish. No, I do think you make a good point. I personally have felt a bit nervous about him this offseason, but, maybe, like you say, we're kind of panicking for no reason. And, he hasn't always had the best quarterback play. Until Tom Brady arrived, he didn't have the best quarterbacks, throwing the ball to him, and he still managed to get 1,000 yards every season. So like you say, a contender, what have you got to lose? A second round pick, and if it means that his 3 touchdown game wins you the Scottish Bowl, like it did for some guy, then, it's worth taking a punt, isn't it? Exactly. On him. I think you do make a fair point, and you can probably get him really cheap at the moment as well. You might not even have to give up a second round pick, someone might take a third for him just to get him off their team, because I think people are really low on him at this point, unless they're a Bucs fan. So I'm sure, Ali, you won't be selling him cheap, but some people I think certainly will. So let's have a quick look at the rest of this division. I'm sure you're looking forward to chatting through some other rivals, Ali, but let's look at the New Orleans Saints. And obviously we know that when Michael Thomas has historically been healthy, he's been an absolute fantasy stud. But the issue we've had is that he's barely played over the past 2 seasons. We've literally barely seen him. So his current ADP is wide receiver 51. So Ali, are you taking a chance on him at this ADP, or do you think he's probably washed and you're kind of staying well away?
Yeah, there's absolutely zero chance that I'll be buying into Michael Thomas. Even with reports that he looks healthy, he's on the field, he's being targeted by Derek Carr, I'm personally staying away. I think his ADP could even creep up slightly higher, because we've seen how dominant Michael Thomas can be in that role in the Saints offense. I'm just going to I think this is personally the last chance you've got to sell Michael Thomas. I think he's 31, something like that. And if he is healthy, if he's going to be playing a few games this year, I think this is your last chance to get out and sell Michael Thomas for something like, I think you can probably talk someone into probably not a second round pick. I'd take a third round pick for him right now, because he's been a guy that has been absolutely nowhere the last 2 seasons. I think the only way that I will be, having Michael Thomas on my team is if I've rode out the last 2 years with Michael Thomas on IR on my bench. Nobody's been wanting to buy Michael Thomas. I just think, your last chance to get out is right now. I can't see him coming back and returning anything more than a wide receiver 4 numbers. So, there's not much ceiling there. I really like Chris Olave. I think this is Chris Olave's offense. There seems to be the great connection with Derek Carr, with Olave. So that's the guy that I'm buying into, and still buying into what is sort of wide receiver 7 ADP. And Michael Thomas is the guy that I'm gonna fade. I don't want anything to do with him.
Yeah, it's one of those where if you still kind of love Michael Thomas and think he is, a fantastic wide receiver, then sure, pay a 3rd round pick if you really want him. Obviously, the risk you have is that ultimately you're not going to get anything back from him. By the end of the season, he will be worth nothing if he doesn't do anything. But if you're still a Michael Thomas believer then, and you want to give up a 3rd round pick, then, why not? I am same as you, Ali. I haven't really been targeting anywhere, Dynasty or not. I'm not convinced that he's going to be able to stay healthy. Like, he's not proven that he's been able to so far. So what makes this season any different? So just quickly looking at the last 2 teams before we wrap up. So the Carolina Panthers, obviously Bryce Young has been hailed as the saviour of all of their kind of quarterback woes that they've had over the past few seasons. But what do you think of his current value at the moment, Ali? Are you liking it? Is he someone that you're taking?
Yeah, I really like Bryce Young. I think eventually he can produce top 12 numbers. Obviously, you're having to take him around about there now. And personally, I don't expect much in year 1. I think he's got a mediocre support cast. I'm sorry, Kev, the weapons aren't great in Carolina. I think the good thing going for them is their defense is really good, and they've got a really good O-line on paper. It didn't look great the other night trying to protect him, and he did look really shaky against the New York Jets. But I think personally that the Panthers could challenge for the division title this year. I think Bryce Young will be sort of a game manager, try and limit mistakes. And personally, I think you could see a slight dip in value come in season. So that would open up a nice buy window for me. I think Bryce Young is a guy that, a bit like a Dak Prescott, could probably sit at the back end of sort of quarterback 1 territory for a lot of his career. I think they're going to upgrade on the weapons come next season. So I think now is the time to. Not now. If he struggles the start of the season, which I expect him, I don't expect him to come out and throw 3 or 4 touchdowns week 1, week 2. I think it's going to be a slow start. They're going to use the run game and defense, and there could be a buy window open up, which is probably where I'd be buying him. But his ranking right now is fair, and I've got him ranked exactly there.
Yeah, he's another one where I'm happy to have taken him in my rookie drafts, but at startups in this offseason, I'm probably less bothered about taking him. Maybe next season that might change, but if I've got him from rookie drafts, great. If not, then he's not someone I'm targeting in startups at the moment. But could well change come next off season. I can't imagine his ADP rising too ridiculously, just because of the way that his play style. He's not an Anthony Richardson where he could pop off and be potentially the QB1. Ultimately that's not going to be the case. So I think if you don't buy him in startups this off season, I don't think you're missing anything by waiting for that till next season. So let's have a quick look at the Atlanta Falcons. So, the guy that I'm interested in talking about is Kyle Pitts. When he came out, everyone was clamoring over each other to draft him. They were like, he's the next coming of God. We need him on our fantasy teams. Unfortunately, he never has quite managed to live up to that hype and the ADP over the past couple of seasons. He did finish as a tight end 5 in his first season, and then the tight end 31 last season. But obviously, I know he was injured. His overall ADP has actually gradually reduced, and he's now currently going around pick 38. despite his tight end ADP remaining as the tight end 3. So I guess my question to you, Ali, is do you think he will ever perform to the ADP and the talent that we know he actually has? And is actually now he a bargain rather than being the expense that he was over the past kind of couple of seasons?
So with Kyle Pitts, I think I wouldn't call him a bargain just yet. I think his ADP would need to continue to fall to a point where his talent and the risk, the reward outweighs the risk. But it is certainly becoming tempting. I think tight end 3 is certainly fair for the position that he's in. Obviously showed that 1,000-yard season in his rookie year. Couple of touchdowns that I think he scored. Would like to have seen a bit more in the end zone of Kyle Pitts, but I just think not much is going to change with Kyle Pitts, certainly this year. I think in order for him to reach his ceiling, I think this offense would need to change. I think Arthur Smith would need to get out of town. I think you need someone else in there that's going to be more aggressive to suit his play style. And then they've just drafted, obviously, Bijan Robinson at pick 8 in the NFL draft. The scheme already was incredibly run heavy. Now you add Bijan Robinson to that, who's going to catch a ton of passes because he's great at it. I just don't think we're going to see the ceiling from Kyle Pitts this year. So I do think it's going to be really interesting what happens to his ADP come next offseason. Is it going to fall? Is he going to fall behind TJ Hockenson if he has a good year? God forbid if Dalton Kincaid breaks the mold of being, rookie tight ends don't do anything year one. But if he catches 8 touchdowns, is he going to fall behind him? I think it's really interesting to see what happens at tight end 3. I'm probably not buying, and in startups, I'm still probably avoiding him unless it's probably a tight end premium where I do really want one of the top 3 or 4 tight ends. But once he gets past Kelsey and Andrews in terms of non-tight end, I tend to fade the tight end position completely and go for sort of a fringe tight end 1 and take a couple of stabs there. So I think he'll do enough this year to remain top 4, top 5 at very worst. But I can't see him leapfrogging. Mark Andrews. Obviously, whatever happens with Kelsey come next off season, he'll be 34 years old. Perhaps he'll leapfrog him just because of age. But I'm still not buying right now. But perhaps if he continues to struggle, perhaps it will open up opportunity to buy him in season at a much reduced cost, because you're still probably paying quite a hefty fee for him if you were to trade for him right now.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Ali. I think ultimately in the offense that he's in, he probably isn't going to be able to produce what we want him to do. So again, I think people are going to start to get a bit more disillusioned, and you might actually find that his price continues to drop, and it gets to an area of the draft where you feel more comfortable that you could potentially take him. So before we kind of finish up, Ali, who is the guy that you want to talk about from this division?
Well, surprisingly enough, I've picked a Buccaneer, and I've gone for Rachaad White. And I'm just interested to see what your views are on Rachaad White, because personally, I just think he's in line to smash pretty much via default this year, because he's clear number 1 on the offense. I think he showed that he can catch a ton of passes last year, even with Leonard Fournette in the lineup. So I think he's going to be a bit like a Najee Harris, where he's going to get so much volume that he's going to be a top, say, 16, 18 running back just based on volume, especially in PPR leagues. And where you're drafting him at running back 24 roundabout there, I think he's going to return some value. So what are your thoughts on Rachaad White?
I did a little bit of digging into him this off season, and obviously, again, I think we've heard this a lot from lots of other people. It's been discussed many times, but neither him or Fournette were particularly effective in this offense last season as runners. Both of them had very poor numbers. Now, like we said earlier, Ali, that O-line was really terrible, so I think that probably does have a factor into it. But it does make me a little bit nervous about his efficiency and whether ultimately in the long term he is suitable as a 3-down back. Like you say, this season I actually think he is. because he's going to get the volume and he is going to easily outperform his ADP. But I do have questions about him longer term. I think he's a great passing back, and I think he certainly will have some value there in the longer term. But I think, ultimately I can't see him being a workhorse for many more seasons. I think they're going to ride him this season because ultimately they're kind of figuring out, what are they going to be this season, and then once this season finishes and they find out where they end up and, whether they can get a QB X, Y, and Z, then ultimately they'll probably start to look at bringing some others in, whether that's through the draft or some other veterans. So I think I would probably be buying him at his ADP this off season with the idea of selling him, in season, later season, where I think ultimately his peak value is going to be. Because as soon as this season is over, I don't believe that he will have this backfield to himself anymore. I think someone's going to come in and that's going to ruin his value. So, as I said, I think he certainly has some fantasy relevance in the longer term, but nowhere near what we expect he's going to have this season.
Yep, that's 100% the way that I would be playing it as well. As in the opportunity that he's got now, I think he's going to smash his ADP and outproduce it, where you can then flip him next season for perhaps a first round pick in season, maybe a future first or a couple of seconds, where you'll make profit on what you paid for him. So that'd 100% be the aim.
Yeah, I agree. And you never know, he might actually prove us wrong and show that he can be a workhorse, but I'm not wholly convinced, to be honest. So really quickly, Ali, thank you so much for your time. And we've been talking for well over an hour, so I really appreciate it. But we always do this with every show, and I can't quite leave without doing it. So every show we have a question. So we ask our previous guests to put forward a question to you, Ali, and then we'll ask you to give you our question for our next guest. So our previous guest was Scott Barrett. He is the CEO of Fantasy Points at Scott Barrett DFB on X, and he posed the following question to you, Ali. Who was your favorite childhood player, and do you think he is or would be good now in the current and modern NFL?
Okay, so my favorite player, sort of growing up, all my first watchings of NFL, then really thinking, my God, that guy is a master, would be Peyton Manning. Would be the guy that I absolutely loved. Just the way that he could dice up a play, read the defense long before the defense even knew what the offense was going to do, and he was an absolute master. So he's the guy that I absolutely loved watching, no matter what team he was on. Some of the calls that he would make, the audibles. He was an absolute master, one of the best quarterbacks of all time. So could he play now? I think 100% he could still read defenses like the back of their hand. I think that would be really exciting to watch. Obviously, towards the end of his career, he completely lost all ability to throw the ball more than 10 yards. So there'd probably have to be 100% dump offs right now. But it would be fun to see him play. And I mean, if it was peak Peyton Manning right now, in terms of fantasy on a decent offense, that is a really scary prospect. So that'd be my guy.
Yeah, great pick. I love it, Ali. So, Ali, do you have a question for our next guest?
Yeah, so this is not actually fantasy related, but I have asked this to a few people. So it'd be, if your NFL team you support right now, for whatever reason, goes bust, they get shut down, or is no longer in the NFL, which NFL team would you then choose to support?
I love it. I really like that question. It made me think, well, who would I choose? And I think there's a few options. I'd have to think about it for some time. I'm not picking a terrible franchise again like I have in the past. I need to pick a good one. So just quickly before we go, Ali, please let everyone know where they can find you and your work, so that they can head over and hear more of what you've got to say.
Yeah, so thanks for having me on, Hannah. You can follow me on X, I suppose, at FF Dynasty Grill. And yeah, listen to the Wildcard Dynasty show that comes out. I think it's dropping tonight, actually. The podcast and the video is dropping on Wednesdays. Absolutely loved our flag plant show this week, and this week coming is our unplant, so that should be a really fun show. And then finally, of finally started writing again. So you can start to see some of my articles come out on King Fantasy Sports. So yeah, that's pretty exciting and very much long overdue.
Yeah, really looking forward to reading those, Ali. And I certainly think by the end of this week, you'll be fed up of talking to me too. But thank you so much for coming on. It's been a great discussion. I've really enjoyed hearing kind of your thoughts and your opinions, and also some of the great advice that you've given us for our Dynasty leagues. So thank you to everyone else who's joined us this evening. That's the end of our show tonight. And we hope to see you again next week when we've got some more division discussions to have with our next guest. So before I leave you, don't forget everyone, keep rushing.